All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second meeting of the Housing Capacity and Urbanization Technical Advisory Committee, which we're calling the CAUTAC. And as you know, this is part of the Oregon Housing Needs Analysis Rulemaking Process, or ONA. So we've already started with two acronyms in the first minute here. We're not going to shy away from them, but we'll do our best to define them as we go along. So if you hear any that you're not familiar with, don't hesitate to let us know. Thank you so much for agreeing to be on the CAUTAC and for being here today. We all, DLCD and all the staff working on the project really appreciate your participation in this process. My name's Steve Faust with 3J Consulting, and I'm going to be the facilitator for this group for the CAUTAC over the next number of meetings. I mentioned again, this is meeting number 2, and just to avoid confusion, that is because I think most of you participated in the first meeting, which was in December, along with the other 2 technical advisory committees for this rulemaking process. So a few housekeeping items and agenda items before we do introductions. We've really tried to design this agenda, and our agendas going forward will be designed to maximize conversation, discussion, and idea generation to the extent possible. So we're not going to spend a lot of time going over the materials that you saw at the first meeting or that were in your packet here today. Please do your best to review those packets prior to our meetings so we can really focus on giving you all a chance to talk and interact. One item you might want to review when you get the chance is on page 4 of the operating principles document you were provided for the last meeting are the meeting ground rules for these meetings. So take a look at those just to keep those fresh in your mind. In terms of logistics, please, to the extent possible, use the hand raise function. It allows me to better track folks as they want to speak. If you're having problems, you can certainly raise your physical hand. You just don't jump up to the top of the screen for me. So use that hand raising function if possible. If you do have any technical assistance needs, let us know. Ingrid Caudell is here to help us with that aspect. I will note that I believe the chat has been disabled for this meeting and for future meetings, because we really want the conversation to happen here on screen with each other rather than in the chat room. So we will keep that function closed. I will mention if there are things that either come to you after our meeting today or any of the meetings, or things you just didn't get a chance to say during the meeting, we will be following up with a mechanism for you all to provide additional comments after our discussions today, and that's something we'll be doing at all the meetings going forward. Maddie, could we pull up the PowerPoint? I just want to review the agenda before we get to introductions. I will note on the agendas that you were sent out, and each agenda going forward is going to have our primary meeting objectives, our discussion needs, and racial equity framework questions to consider. We'll hear more about those in just a moment, but those kind of help frame each of our meetings going forward. I'll just keep going. In terms of the agenda itself, which is forthcoming, we are going to spend just a little bit of time, if we can go to the next slide, revisiting some information from your orientation, even though this is probably the one meeting where we'll do that. We're going to look at an overview of the process, including milestones and deliverables, and then do a brief recap of the items listed there, the racial equity framework, the LCDC charge and legislative direction, and other themes from orientation. Following that, we're going to do a little bit more in-depth introductions and and want to hear from you more about your experience and understanding of some of the topics and the work that we're going to be talking about through this process. And then we're going to do an introduction to buildable land inventories, which is going to be our first substantive topic that we're going to be talking about before we wrap up with a little recap and next steps. So if there aren't any questions about those housekeeping items or the agenda, we're going to do introductions. Again, we're going to be talking a little bit more later. So at this point in time, we just want to keep it really brief to your name and affiliation. Again, my name is Steve Faust with 3J Consulting, and I'll be your facilitator. And let's go over to Beth.
I'm Beth Goodman with Echo Northwest. I'm here as a subject matter expert on BLIs.
Thanks, Beth. Now we'll check in with our DLCD staff, starting with Ingrid.
Hi, everyone. Ingrid Cordell. I'm the Advisory Committee Coordinator for DLCD, admin support for all of you during these meetings. You can chat directly to me if you need to. And I will hand over to Karen.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Karen Guillen Chapman. I realize that's a mouthful. Karen's just fine as well. I serve as DLCD's UGB specialist, and maybe I'll hand it over to Jenna.
Hi, everyone. My name is Jenna Hughes. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a housing and growth management analyst with DLCD. And I will pass it to Madeline.
Hi, everyone. My name is Madeline Phillips. I am the public facilities planner for the Department of Land Conservation and Development on the Housing and Urbanization team. Thanks for being here, and I will pass it back to Steve.
Yeah, and before we jump into our committee members, which I'll just walk through alphabetically, I think I see Kevin from DLCD is in the room. So Kevin, do you want to introduce yourself?
Thanks, Steve. Appreciate it. I'm Kevin Young. I'm a senior urban planner with DLCD. I have been reviewing the housing capacity analyses, BLIs, for the last several years for the agency.
Thanks, Kevin. Now to our TAC members. Again, this is first name alphabetical, so we'll start with Al.
Hi, everybody. I see introductions. I can't see myself, so I don't know if I'm there, but yeah. Hi, I'm a retired my name is Al Johnson, and good to see you all. A lot of familiar faces. I'm a retired land use lawyer. I have also been a LCDC hearings official going back to the late 70s, and I've been working with Goal 10 and buildable lands inventories and the accounting practices for determining urban lands, residential lands capacities for 50 years and counting. I feel a little bit like a Red Sox or a Cub fan, but you know, it's nice to see we're starting to win a few rounds. So very happy to be here, and I hope I can provide something in the way of institutional memory. Thanks.
Thank you, Al. And again, everybody, we are going to have time for a little bit more lengthy introductions. So we want to kind of move through quickly here, and I'll go to Ariel. Ariel is here.
I haven't seen her join yet.
Okay.
Steve.
Is Brandon Persinger here?
I am. Good afternoon, everyone. Brandon Persinger with the Association of Oregon Counties. I do natural resources and land use. Thanks.
And we are fortunate enough to have two Brandons on our committee. You want to go ahead, Brandon?
Yeah, Brandon Seitz. I'm the Community Development Director for the City of Umatilla out in Eastern Oregon.
Thank you. And Brock?
Everyone, Brock Nation, he, him, Policy Director at Oregon Realtors. Good to see you all.
And Cassara?
Hi, everyone. Cassara Phipps, Principal Planner with Clean Water Services.
Chelsea?
Hi, City of Coos Bay Community Development Director, Chelsea Schnabel.
Welcome, Chelsea. Corey?
Hey everybody, I'm Corey Harlan. I'm the Cities and Towns Program Director with Central Oregon Land Watch based in Bend.
Right, and Kurt?
Kurt Fisher, Associate Planner with the Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. I provide planning services for 8 communities in the Mid-Willamette Valley.
Damien?
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Damian Cernick. I'm a Senior Long Range Planner with the City of Bend.
All right, Derek? Is Derek here? There.
Yeah, good afternoon. Derek Tokos, Community Development Director for the City of Newport.
Welcome. Alyssa?
Hi there, I am Alyssa Gertler, she, her pronouns. I am the housing manager for Clatsop County in Northwest Oregon.
Welcome. Excuse me. Heather O'Donnell couldn't make it today, but Rebecca's with us from the city of Eugene.
Well, you just did my introduction.
Well, I know. I tried to stop myself. Do it again.
Rebecca Gershow, Senior Planner, City of Eugene.
Thank you. Joy? All right. I'm not seeing Joy. Let's go to Ken.
I'm Ken Koblitz, Development Engineering Manager for the City of Gresham.
And Martha?
Hi there, I'm Martha Fritzy, Principal Planner with Clackamas County.
And Mary Kyle?
Mary Kyle McCurdy, she, her pronouns with 1000 Friends of Oregon.
Welcome. Samantha?
Sam was on for a second, but I think she's traveling, might have hit a dead spot. But Samantha Bayer from the Oregon Home Builders Association.
Thank you, Brock. Is Sam, not Samantha, but Sam here? Didn't see him in the room. Okay. And then Ted.
Hello, Ted Reed, Metro Planning, Development, and Research.
Great. Well, welcome everyone again. Thank you for being here and participating on this committee. We'll have more time for introductions soon. But right now, I'm going to hand it over to Maddie as we start our agenda and do some milestones, look at milestones. Madeline?
Thank you, Steve. Friends and colleagues call me Maddie, so you're more than welcome to do that too. All thanks again for joining us today. I'm here to share just a little bit about the milestones and materials that we'll be working through as a team, as an advisory committee together. First and foremost, just a reminder that our work is legislatively directed to a set of questions, which I'll cover in just a moment on the next slide. But generally, we're seeking your expertise in the topic areas related to capacity and urbanization, as the name of our attack might describe. And particularly, we're hoping that you're able to help us determine not only some rulemaking, but also the creation of guidance materials and determining how to navigate through a set of spirited conversations as to how we might resolve some of the challenges that we see in our landscape related to several topics around capacity and urbanization. Just a reminder, the road is long for us. We, as a TAC, are meeting for quite a bit longer than the other 2 topic areas. You'll see on the screen that there's a general outline that has a few key milestones, one of which we've already passed, which was the short legislative session, which just closed. We're approaching a particular milestone or deadline that was assigned to us as a group, but more specifically to folks like me focused on infrastructure, that's due at the end of December of this year. And we'll talk a little bit more about that soon. For better or worse, we will be pausing through legislative sessions, specifically the legislative session at January of 2025. And midway through 2025, we hope to have some draft rules that will be the result of our, again, spirited conversations, leading up to a deadline for rule adoption, which is a notification to the Secretary of State on the 1st of January in 2026. So here we are at this nice yellow star at the beginning. and we'll be working together through a set of questions. Those questions are, if I am able to advance my slide, are related to capacity and urbanization. First and foremost, refinement of buildable land inventories. We know that there are some uncertainty areas and some gray areas that cities have been working through related to buildable land that we'd like to work through with you. Furthermore, we're focused very diligently on development readiness and the coordination of public facilities, both within existing UGBs, so within existing city limits and UGBs, in addition to those areas that communities seek to bring into their urban growth boundary. And finally, to address the big questions around urban growth boundaries, both amendments, exchanges, and the urban and rural reserve process. So those are some big topics that we will get into in our work together, and we greatly appreciate the amount of knowledge and experience that's in this room and your willingness to contribute to some of these conversations. Just as a housekeeping item, we will be meeting monthly until June. And then once we reach July, early summer, we'll be starting a more frequent visiting together two times a month starting in July. And we hope to be able to stay in touch with you in between meetings through what you all received earlier, which we're calling a project digest, somewhat of a campy way of staying in touch, a little newsletter that helps you know what we're working on, we team at DLCD, and we may very well and certainly ask you for your support and resources as we move through certain questions. You all are our extended Rolodex, we hope, to use a really antiquated term, but you hold some connections to folks that know a lot and have done a lot, and it sounds just from the introductions that there's quite a bit of experience here in the room that we hope to draw on. Just to give you a quick overview of the flow of our discussions, we'll be looking at refining our problem statements early in this discussion and then seeking policy direction on a series of topics, those of which I just described. We'll be moving through some refinements and discussion in the middle of our our workflow together. And then finally, we'll be developing a set of draft rules that we hope to be able to move forward with. With those draft rules, there will be some complementary guidance that we hope will help local governments navigate some of the challenging areas that either are enshrined in rule or perhaps don't make it quite into the rules themselves, but are some best practices that we hope will reduce the amount of uncertainty and provide clarity to local governments as they navigate through Goal 10 and Goal 14 work. Before I hand it off to anyone, to others on our team, are there any questions that I could answer from the group? Okay, Steve, back to you.
Okay, actually, at this point, we're going to hand it over to Jenna to touch on some of those topics that we mentioned. You talked about it at meeting number 1, but we want to kind of refresh your memories. So, Jenna.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. I think, we can just move on to the next slide, and I'll just be going through several topics, starting with our racial equity framework for decision making. And this is a document that was linked in your meeting materials, so you're welcome to refer back to that. This is something that was adopted by LCDC last year and really sets an expectation for staff and advisory committees for all rulemaking processes. The framework includes a series of analysis questions organized by these 8 topic areas. And this framework will be an important part of the ONA rulemaking and will help ensure that we are thinking through all of these topic areas and the questions within them to help guide our decision making and to create equitable outcomes. So we will be referencing this and raising questions outlined in the framework throughout our time together. So you all will become very familiar with this. And in particular, I want to highlight just a couple sections for consideration, and we can move to the next slide. The two questions I want to highlight are under historical inequities and benefits and burdens, and they're bolded on this slide. One is what mechanisms under the jurisdiction of the Oregon Land Use Planning Program can assist in reducing historical inequities? And the second question I would like everyone to think about is who might benefit from and who might be most burdened by the actions we are talking about in this TAC. So as many of you know, Oregon has a particularly unique history of government actions that have resulted in disproportionate impacts for communities of color and other underserved populations that are still prevalent today. And these are outcomes such as a lack of affordable housing and housing options, segregation, displacement, the home ownership gap and related racial wealth gap, climate impacts, public health impacts, and more. And so it is our responsibility to not only acknowledge these historical inequities, but actively work to address them in this work. And I also just want to say that if anyone has any interest or would like to learn more about Oregon's historical context, please do not hesitate to reach out to any of us, staff, facilitators outside of this meeting, and we're happy to provide more resources on this topic. But considering these particular questions in relation to the CalTAC work, we might ask ourselves, how might we think about benefits, burdens, and historical inequities related to zoning and housing patterns that can reduce exclusion and segregation, how housing is distributed and the location of housing in infill areas versus at the edge of a UGB, thinking about redevelopment and displacement risk mitigation. And then also, how can we think about infrastructure financing in an equitable way and how investments are prioritized to benefit certain populations? So we are not seeking to answer these questions today. These are very big questions, but use of this framework will be an expectation for all of us and an ongoing theme throughout this work. So I encourage you all to review the framework and just be thinking about these questions and how we can integrate them in terms of capacity and urbanization. And you're also welcome to send us your thoughts after this meeting if there are certain ideas that come up for you, and we can definitely discuss those in a future meeting. Before we move on, though, I do want to pause and see if anyone has any questions on this and how we're using this racial equity framework before we continue on. So.
Any questions for Jenna? Not seeing any.
Okay, great. Well, then we can move on to the next slide. So we discussed this last time. The legislative direction of House Bill 2001 is for LCDC to adopt rules and guidance related to the topics listed here. And our work together in the CalTAC will especially focus on the last three bullets: buildable lands in housing capacity, urban growth boundary amendments, and urban and rural reserves. Next slide. And the LCDC ONA, or Oregon Housing Needs Analysis rulemaking charge, is detailed in the operating principles that were included in the orientation packet. It provides guidance to DLCD to implement the legislative direction in consideration of 3 main policy areas related to affirmatively furthering fair housing and providing adoption-ready policies, which is what the Needs and Productions TAC is focusing on. Creating clarity and certainty when it comes to urbanization planning processes, which is the work that we are doing here, and creating a reasonable and consistent accountability framework, which is the work that the Housing Accountability TAC is working on. Next slide. So also at the TAC orientation, you all participated in a Miro board activity that asked what key outcomes you think need to be achieved to address the legislative direction, along with what policy tensions or challenges you expect to arise. There were a lot of comments. These are just a few of the top themes that we heard. So some of these themes included better understanding development constraints, creating certainty for cities and reducing litigation risk, and consideration of other state planning goals in their intersection with Goal 10 housing and Goal 14 urbanization. Next slide. And I believe Cotton is going to talk through this slide, correct?
Yeah, I'm going to be really brief because next we're going to get into deep dive, getting to know each other and some discussion around these topics. But before we do that, I just wanted to orientate that there's quite a bit of work and legislation that precedes our work here as a group. And all of these, several of you will recognize and know these pieces of legislation pretty in depth and have worked with it. But an overarching principle here is all of these pieces of legislation have worked up to the goals of what the ONA intends, the legislative intent for the ONA goals, and what we are to accomplish with that legislation. And they all have an alignment and a consistency that we are balancing both the protection of natural resources and resource lands with supporting the production of housing and defining needed housing and making policy decisions around the support of needed housing and that variety of issues across different communities in Oregon. But as we look back to the work, you'll see that throughout each piece of legislation, it's asking us to really balance those priorities. And I think as we move forward, we'll revisit both the legislative direction and both the commission's charge to us and think about how we're balancing these principles and these guidance with the work that we're set out to do and the opportunities where we see for greater clarity and certainty in this type of work at the local level. So feel free to visit any of these. If you have any follow-up questions, let us know. But I think, Steve, we're ready to do our first discussion.
Yeah, thank you, Cotton. And so here we just, first of all, hopefully that was a good framework for everyone. And if you have questions later, any of the DLCD team and myself or Beth are happy to answer questions you might have. But we wanted to take a little more time to get to know each other and learn about folks' experience with these topics. So the 2 questions that we want to ask, if we could go to the next slide, I think they're presented there. But one is, what is your connection to or experience with housing capacity and urbanization? And the second is, why did you volunteer to participate on the CAWTAC? And you can answer one or both of those questions as you see fit. With the time we have allotted, that means about 1 minute per person. I'm going to try to hold people to about a minute per person. And I think maybe we'll go in reverse order that we did before, just to kind of keep things organized. I think a few people might have jumped into the meeting too, since we did our first introduction. So let's start with Ted.
Okay. Again, Ted Reed with Metro Regional Planning. My connection to this is having been project manager for a number of urban growth management decisions for the Metro region, working on this issue going back to 2009. So a core aspect of what we have to do is inventory capacity inside the urban growth boundary. So a lot of interest and experience with the topic.
Oh, thanks, Ted. That was very efficient. Next is Sam Brookham in the room. Let's see if Sam had joined us. Okay. And if not, how about Samantha Bayer? Okay, still on that out of service. Mary Kyle.
Thank you. I've been involved with the housing capacity analysis for a number of cities over the years, both in the Metro urban growth reports and analysis of the Metro UGB capacity, as well as a number of cities of different sizes throughout the state. And I volunteered to participate in this group because I think, like what was discovered in the or illuminated in the owner report, was that too much of that has been based on kind of repeating and projecting forward the same ways in which we've used land in the past, and that isn't serving the housing needs of all Oregonians. And it's also highlighted the need to update a lot of the databases that cities need and rely upon in evaluating their buildable lands inventories, and that the state or cities need funding and investment in order to do that. So just a few things.
Great, all important topics. Okay, Martha.
Oh boy. I have a lot of things to say. I'll try to keep it to a minute. So I'm connected to this in a number of different ways. But of course, working for Clackamas County, we recently, these new Goal 10 and housing production strategies and other requirements that cities have had to do for a little while now have now suddenly been put on the county as well for our urban unincorporated area. And so I'm interested to learn about that and other experiences and the ways that this work has been done. Of course, Clackamas County is particularly interested in urban growth boundary expansions and exchanges and reserves. And I guess one thing that a lot of people probably don't know about me is that I personally am really just interested in this because I love data and I'm a bit of a geek. And actually, prior to working for Clackamas County, I was a consultant and actually did housing needs analyses and goal and EOAs, goal 9 and 10 analyses. And of course, that's sort of under the old structure. So I understand that structure. And I just sort of personally am interested in understanding how sort of this is going to move forward and create hopefully a better outcome.
Great, thank you, Martha.
Was that a minute? That's probably
that was approximately a minute. That's, Ted, you got some of Ted's time. Let's go to Ken.
All right, so my work is related to urban growth boundary and urban services in the city of Gresham. We work primarily with development community, and so most of our development is happening in those areas, and we struggle with the infrastructure side of things. And so that's where my group coordinates with development on figuring out how to get the infrastructure out there, and also system development charges that are related to that, both for funding and for building of the infrastructure. And really, I work with my director on discussions of who is going to participate in this. And I raised my hand because I kind of wanted to learn what everybody else was doing and be hopefully part of the solution.
Great, thank you, Ken. And certainly, as mentioned earlier, infrastructure, something we'll be talking about. I don't see, correct me if I'm wrong, I don't see Joy in the room. So I would then move to Rebecca. Oh, you're on mute, Rebecca.
Thank you. Rebecca Gershow, City of Eugene. I am tag teaming on the CowTac with my colleague Heather O'Donnell, who is primarily going to be involved in this first area when we're talking about the BLI and the UGB. My reason for being pulled into this is because since most of the time since 2018, when I've been working for City of Eugene, I've been working on our urban reserves analysis and subsequent adoption. And so that's probably going to be most of my voice on this in terms of input, but also will be working on our eventual, if needed, UGB analysis process if our numbers show that we do in fact need to expand, which we're currently working on right now. So I'm coming from both of those perspectives, and yeah, I think that's it.
Great. Thank you, Rebecca. Let's go to Alyssa.
All right. Well, as I mentioned before, I am the housing manager for Clatsop County on the coast. And before that, I spent quite a few years working for Metro and Clackamas County in the metro area. So I think I bring a good urban and rural perspective that sort of helps understand the similarities and differences around urbanization, land readiness. The coast in particular is very land constrained. And so thinking about working on what it means to look at buildable lands through that lens, I think is something that I can bring to the table as well. Yeah, I guess that's about it.
Thank you, Alyssa. And I'm going to loop back to Lauren. I think I have an outdated roster, so I missed Lauren. Do you want to share your responses to these questions, please?
Hi, I'm Lauren with the Oregon Farm Bureau, and my connection to this and why I volunteered is because we would like to bring the voice of agriculture into this space since we're affected by urbanization and urban growth, and it's, I think, important that we consider how it would affect agriculture in our communities.
Thank you, Lauren, and I apologize for missing you earlier. Derek.
Yes, thank you. Derek Tokos, I've been practicing in planning now close to 30 years, probably shows with Baird. First 5 in Colorado, but then the bulk of my career has been in Oregon. I worked with Multnomah County for about a dozen years and had the opportunity to work as representative of Multnomah County with Metro and on the urbanization issues up there for a number of years. Helped the county navigate the Measure 37 challenges as well. Have been with Newport for over 14 years now and have helped Newport through a couple of different housing capacity updates, first in 2011, 12, and then again in 2022, 2023, and have implemented many of the strategies outlined and have had the opportunity to really kind of, being in a smaller community, really coordinate the extension of infrastructure, financing of infrastructure, so that some of these projects can happen and how the city can help facilitate housing construction of various types. So I'd like to, I'm interested in bringing that expertise to the table and kind of helping this process along.
Thank you, Derek. Let's go to Damien.
Thanks, Steve. Good afternoon again, everybody. My name is Damien Cernick. Like Derek, I am also a senior planner. I've spent 30 years of my career here in Bend, 10 with Deschutes County, and the last 20 with the city of Bend. My connection with this work as a practitioner, I've worked for the city on 3 UGB amendments, 1 that was remanded, 2 that were acknowledged. I also bring some experience in area planning for one of our expansion areas that was completed 3 years ago. But I've also had quite a bit of experience with public facility planning, including both our water system and then our sewer collection and treatment systems. And we're beginning to start work again here on an update to our collection system master plan here fairly soon. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Damien. Kurt.
Hello, I'm Kurt Fisher, Associate Planner with Mid-Willamette Valley Council of Governments. As I said before, I do planning for 8 communities in the Mid-Willamette Valley. They are all under 3,500 in population. So I definitely bring the perspective of our smaller cities to the table. I think they have a lot of attributes that make them attractive places for new housing and provide a high quality of life for future residents. Just about every community has empty spaces on their map that appear to the naked eye to be ripe for housing, but it's what's in the ground or what's not in the ground that is really holding things back. And just about every one of those spaces that could be developed with housing, there's an underlying infrastructure deficiency there preventing it. I've been with a COG for a year now. Most of my planning experience is actually on the private side, working with private housing producers, working with developers, navigating the development process to bring housing to some of these more difficult to develop areas in cities of all sizes across the state. So that's what I bring. Public and private perspective both. To number two, I think one thing that isn't captured in all this is just to participate and understand the rulemaking process better.
Great, thank you, Kurt.
Debating my volunteering.
Oh, sorry. Let's go to Corey.
Yeah, hey everybody, Corey here again. Central Oregon Land Watch, we're a land use and conservation advocacy organization here in Bend. We've been around for over 30 years. I think folks are pretty well aware. Deschutes, Jefferson, and Crook County, Central Oregon is the fastest growing place in the state. And so a big part of what Land Watch is here to do is to really help ensure that we grow well and grow with intention. A big part of the work for cities and towns is really trying to deliver complete communities to Bend into Central Oregon. And we really focus a lot on our expansion areas, our opportunity areas that were identified in our last 2016 UGB expansion, and really trying to ensure that those places develop well and deliver the kind of housing and services and jobs that we intended them to deliver when we planned that. So 2016, you heard from Damien, my organization was deeply involved in that UGB expansion. And I think just a few other things to touch on. I think from Landwatch's perspective, we're really in the urban space and really focused on infrastructure. And so I'm really glad that the development and land readiness piece is a big part of what this group is going to be looking at, because we're keenly interested in that and know that's a big thing that we need to grapple with in our community. And I think I was really interested in serving on this because I think, I just want to help ensure that our land use system continues to be responsive to the challenges of our time, and that's housing and climate change. And so I think that's just a great opportunity to be with a really smart group of committed, passionate folks to help figure that out. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. Chelsea.
Yes. Hi. So my experience is just on the local planner level, same as a lot of people have already said. I think I would like to be able to add a voice for the South Coast specifically, maybe. And City of Coos Bay has a unique shared urban growth boundary with Coos County. And so keeping that and has issues and barriers to being able to implement it how those who kind of created it in the day thought that it was going to work. And so trying to keep that in mind as we work through this process just generally. But I think everything everybody has already said is really great and valid, and I am I'm at a loss for words. My brain has been fried today. But generally just a voice for the South Coast, and for the City of Coos Bay, this is near and dear. UGB urbanization expansion and the need for more housing is near and dear to their heart.
Thank you, Chelsea. Everybody's doing great. We're right on time. Let's go to Casera.
Hi, everyone. Sarah Phipps with Clean Water Services. We provide sanitary, sewer, and stormwater management in Washington County. For those of you who may not be familiar with Washington County, a lot of the recent urban growth boundary expansions in the metro area have occurred on kind of the west side of town here. And so at Clean Water Services, we're doing a lot of planning to provide services for those areas. Prior to my role with Clean Water Services, I was with the city of Beaverton and was directly involved in buildable lands inventory updates, both citywide as well as for an urban reserve area. So I'm very familiar being on kind of the land use planner side of things as well. And that gets to number two. I'm just really interested in kind of the intersection of land use and utilities. We've heard a lot about land readiness, and as a utility provider, just want to kind of, advocate for infrastructure, that's really taken into consideration in the planning process, and do what we can to support housing production.
Thank you. Let's go to Brock.
Hey everyone, connection to the experience, basically everything that has happened at the state level from a land use, housing, and urbanization perspective since fall 2021 when I started here. That includes CFEC rulemaking, the owner work groups, housing, urbanization, and land use legislation that's happened in recent years, as well as this RAC, this TAC, and the Needs and Protection Technical Advisory Committee as well. Why did I volunteer to participate here? One, I agree with Martha. I am very data driven. Show me the numbers, show me how it works, and let's make it happen. And I also agree with Corey. This is one of the defining challenges of our generation, and we need to make sure that we do it and we do it right. We've been falling behind on the issue of housing, and particularly as it relates to supply and affordability for way too long, and it's time to catch up. And so I'm excited to work with this group to help us do that.
Great. Let's go to Brandon Seitz.
Yeah, Brandon Seitz, City of Umatilla again. Really kind of from the local planner perspective, being a small municipality, it just recently went through a UGB expansion in 2001 successfully. Just kind of understand the kind of the onus that can put on a lot of small communities, especially where you're trying to forecast out some of these things and you maybe don't have dedicated staff or, budget for consulting, some of those types of things. Why am I participating is, obviously, I said we just did the UGB expansion, and fortunately for us, we've been really experiencing a bit of a boom. So we are we are already gearing up for another buildable lands inventory update. So just wanting to say, kind of plugged into, the rulemaking process, because it is something we'll likely be looking at probably on the industrial side here again in the very near future. And having just kind of went through this process from the, kind of small Eastern Oregon municipality, I think I can certainly offer some insight for some of those challenges.
Great, thank you. Brandon Persinger.
Yeah, hello everyone. Brandon Persinger again, Association of Oregon Counties. Here really to provide a voice for Oregon's 36 counties as it pertains to this discussion here. So you all are probably aware counties are the entities that are responsible for updating the comprehensive plans, specifically as it pertains to planning activities within the counties, but also, that would include any planning activities done by cities, special districts, boundary changes, etc. So why this TAC specifically? I think it's probably self-explanatory with what I just said. This capacity urbanization TAC is going to focus on buildable land inventory, UGB amendments, UGB land exchanges, urban reserves, that sort of thing. So kind of all fits pretty well into the comprehensive plan updates that counties are responsible for. So thanks.
Great. We get to hear from Ariel.
Hi, everyone. Apologies for being late and missing introductions. I'm Ariel Nelson with the League of Oregon Cities. Very similar in my role to my counterpart, Brandon, at AOC. At LOC, we represent all 241 incorporated cities in the state. So my connection and experience, working at the league, I've been at the league for close to 5 years now. And before that, I was at Oregon Housing and Community Services. So I've been in and around a lot of these conversations and changes and updates to our land use system for a number of years now, even thinking back to 2019 when House Bill 2003 was passed, which was kind of the the precursor to the ONA. Doing these conversations. Why did I volunteer? I don't know if I volunteer or tiered, or I need to be here. I'm on all the tax and the rack. But really appreciate that we've got a good, diverse perspective from local practitioners at the cities and counties on this tax. So definitely we'll be letting those experts lead. And I think Coos Bay probably has maybe one of the most individual unique situations, but I think, if you talk to any jurisdiction, they've got something unique about their land capacity and their urban growth boundary and their needs and their barriers and their opportunities. So my role is really to make sure I'm considering those cities that are not at the table and making sure that I'm supporting the members that are here at the table and also connecting the dots to the other racks and tax and other rulemaking conversations and other legislative conversations that have happened or will be happening. So thanks for having me here.
Thanks for being here, Ariel. Whether you volunteered or were voluntold, we appreciate you having you as part of the group. And then finally, Al.
Welcome back, everybody. As I said earlier, I think I'm here partly to provide some institutional memory. I've lived in 3 major urban areas, Eugene and Portland and Bend, and I have had a statewide land use practice for many, many years. During that time, most or much of the Gold 10, LUBA, and Court of Appeals litigation has been litigation that I've been involved with when it involved Gold 10. So a lot of history there. And I also have served on that public side as co-chair of the Residential Technical Advisory Committee for Bend. So I worked with Damien in the past and with Landwatch, and so I'm familiar with that history. I also have a history of dealing with the issues that relate to rulemaking procedures and what should be in a rule, what should be in a goal, what should be in guidance, which has come up in the course of a number of cases. My main interest, I'm here because I've been doing this and inertial velocity. I'm not sure what you call it, but glad to be here.
Thank you, Al, and thank you, everyone. I think it's really helpful to understand where everyone's coming from. We clearly have a wide variety of perspectives, large and small communities, city, county, different regions of the state, conservation, infrastructure and land readiness, housing and climate change, and a lot of other considerations and perspectives. So thank you all for sharing. I think that helps us just understand who's in the room and sets us up for some productive conversations going forward. So with that, we're going to move to our first substantive topic. We can go to the, I don't know about the next slide, which is about buildable lands inventory. And Beth is going to talk a little bit about that. So Beth, take it away.
Thank you very much. I'm going to walk you through an example buildable lands inventory. I've worked with a number of you on developing buildable lands inventories, so I know that this will be a review for you. And for people who haven't been through a buildable lands inventory, want to give them some context, some information to connect ideas to. So we're going to look at Madras' buildable lands inventory, which we completed last year. Madras is a city of a little under 10,000 people. So it's small enough to be understandable, but and big enough to be interesting. Next slide, please. So when you're doing a buildable lands inventory, if you could hop back one slide, please, Maddie. You start with all land within the urban growth boundary that is either residentially designated or residentially zoned, or where you can do housing with clear and objective, where there are clear and objective standards. So that means here Madras has a funny shape. They've got all their industrial and their airport up to the north. But that means we've got all of our moderate density, the higher density housing, the planned residential housing, and then 2 commercial zones, the downtown commercial and the community commercial, where housing can be built outright under clear and objective standards. We've also got some county zones here because there's land inside the urban growth boundary that is not inside the city limits, so it hasn't been annexed. And Madras is a one map city, so they don't have separate comprehensive plan areas, designations that would cover those county areas. So what zoning that county land will have when it comes into the urban growth and when it comes into the city is a question. It's unknown. So next slide, please. So the first thing you do, you've got a base of land, and some of it's developed. So we some of it's vacant. We develop definitions, land classifications that are mutually exclusive so that every parcel, residential, including the commercial areas, fit into one of these designations. So developed is land that's developed consistent with current zoning. Some land that is developed may be identified as potentially redevelopable later, but that's not mapped and that's not in this step. And then we look at land, I'm going to skip to public. So land that's in federal, state, county, city, tribal, school, or other public entity ownership. We also put in that category cemeteries, because cemeteries are not going to develop with new uses. So you might have something like a park. It looks vacant, but it's publicly owned and it's publicly for a park. So we've got the public category, and then you look at the other land, you've got vacant land. And so you have to figure out land. How do you define vacant? We happen to define it as lots that have no structures or where the buildings have an improvement value of $10,000 or less. And then you have the lots that have some use on it already, some usually residential use, but could be further subdivided within the current zones. We call that partially vacant. So if you imagine, say, a 5-acre piece of land that has one house on it, you can easily imagine how that house remains there and the rest of that land is further subdivided. And we've got methodologies that we can use that are related to state administrative rules to identify, say, half-acre parcels. How much of that is partially vacant? So we can use those sometimes in the definition. So all pieces of land get into one of these categories. There's another little category that's much less official, but it's little fragments of land. We call that undevelopable land. So when you use GIS, oftentimes you get little slivers of land where your boundaries don't meet up exactly. So they're not even parcels a lot of the times. They're just little slivers that are left over. So on the next slide, please. Then we look at constraints. So you've got constraints like the FEMA floodway. That is one that we certainly always consider as a constraint to develop wherever you've got the floodway, even if you've got vacant land, that land is considered undevelopable. The floodplain is an optional constraint. Some cities don't consider it a constraint to development, and some cities do. Landslides, where you've got high and very high susceptibility for landslides, and this is based on state DOGAMI data. Again, that's something that is a policy choice that cities make to use that, but it's a Goal 7 hazard. So it's I think there's a health and safety reason to use that. Slopes considered that are steeper than 25% are often considered undevelopable, so they're considered constraints. Some cities choose to use a steeper slope than that. Some cities like 30%. Some cities choose to use a little bit of a variation on that. Then we also look at local constraints like riparian corridors, where the city has policies about not developing within, say, a buffer of some number of feet from the riparian corridor. Things like the Bonneville Power Administration right-of-way. There's a little tiny corner of that in Madras. Wetlands are one that we'll talk about later in the process. I expect they're much more complex. So next slide. So we do some GIS work, and in the end, we get all the land within the urban growth boundary in each development status. And here we're showing you this with hash marks where there are constraints. So you can see through the middle of Madras, you can see that floodway through the middle of Madras. And I know that you guys got this in a memorandum, so you can look at it in something that's a little bit easier to see than this slide. But we're showing vacant land, we're showing partially vacant land in red and yellow respectively, developed land in gray, public land in green, and undevelopable, it's hard to see those little slivers. So all of that land that we showed originally on the first slide is categorized into one of these categories. On the next slide, please. What we're going to show you is just the land that is potentially buildable with the constraints taken out. So you see right through the middle of Madras, that big white area. It's not that there's not any vacant land there. It's that there's no vacant unconstrained land there because that's in the floodway. You can see, say, in some of the orange areas where you have little fingers of vacant land, those are hillside type constraints, maybe steep slopes, maybe landslide hazards. You see we've done this for all of those zones that we had on the first map. And the table on the left-hand side, you can see that Madras has a cumulative of 893 buildable acres. You'll see that about 10 of those buildable acres are in commercial zones, which I'll talk about very briefly. And all the rest of it is in residential zones. You can see that 614 acres are on vacant lots and 318 are on partially vacant lots, which happens to be a nice division of about 2/3, 1/3 of land. That's not all that unusual in partially vacant. The next step after this, which we're not going to go into right now, is stepping from your vacant buildable land, your unconstrained buildable land, onto your capacity. So how much housing can that land accommodate within your existing zoning or comprehensive plan rules? The one thing to know about the commercial land is we often don't assume that 100% of that commercial land will develop with housing because you have obviously commercial growth needs to happen on there also. So looking at a mixture of uses, and that's something that you can do differently in different cities. So I can't remember what the next slide is. I think it goes into questions. So before we go to that, if we can go back a slide, are there any questions about how we do this? There's different ways of doing this. I know, for instance, Metro takes a different approach, say to partially vacant land. Different ways of looking at some different constraints. You can have constraints that are partially partial constraints and not full constraints.
A reminder, if you do have questions, to use the raised hand function, and people are right on top of it. So let's start with Kasara.
Hi, thank you for the overview, Beth. I think maybe my question does relate to the Metro on some of the developed parcels and the kind of land to building ratio, the opportunities for redevelopment. And then kind of maybe related to that is, do you look at land assembly? So whether some of those, potentially redevelopable lots or developed lots or adjacent to one another, developers oftentimes will maybe buy up 2 or 3 lots to put a larger development there.
I'll probably invite Ted in a moment or two to comment more on the way that Metro does it. Outside of metro cities, we have at various points tried to do a simple, so not an expensive, a quantitative estimate of redevelopment potential, and they result in big estimates of redevelopment potential. But we know, having lived in our cities for so long, that redevelopment happens in idiosyncratic ways. So you mentioned opportunity for land assembly. That's certainly an interesting way and a good way of getting redevelopment, but doing that land assembly is complicated. So a piece of land that may look like it's got a shack on it and it's in downtown and you'd think that it would redevelop, but it's been sitting there for 20 years, not redeveloped. Why is that? Well, the landowner has certain preferences, or maybe, doesn't want to redevelop their land, or maybe it's owned by a trust that's controlled by multiple people who can't agree on what to do with it, or an absentee landowner who's just not interested. So we often take a little different approach to redevelopment, and work with the city to identify sites where it's more likely that redevelopment will happen, especially in downtowns. That can be a really complex set of questions. Steve, do we want to give Ted a moment to say how Metro does it, or do we want to go on to more questions?
I think we'll have plenty of time for that. What I'd like to do is move through the 3 hands that we have raised, and then Karin's going to talk a little bit before we just open up for a bit of discussion. So, Al, you're up next. We'll loop back with Al then. Rebecca, why don't you go ahead?
Yeah, Beth, quick question, because you've done so much of this all around the state. Do you have a sense of how many communities, or generally how many communities use 100-year floodplain as a constraint?
Let's say in the last decade or so, because I can't remember beyond that, almost all, both on housing and on commercial and industrial, so economic development. I've had a few who have chosen not to, and it's often because their floodplain maps they think are really wrong. And these were further out Eastern Oregon cities, which have different flood conditions in certain ways than Western Oregon. So mostly all of them.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm back, Steve. I got my unmuted. Okay, just a quick question. Beth, is that Madras doesn't have mixed use development in its mix there. Do you handle that the same way you handle commercial, where residential is allowed?
Yeah, especially if commercial or some other employment use is allowed on first floors. So you could have a full building that was just employment. And we tend to look back at history, for instance, to see how much happened in the past, and then make some reasonable future estimate based on what we know are current conditions.
Great. And Brock?
2 more comments than questions, but I'll just make them quick. One, appreciate the 100-year floodplain comment, particularly as it's going to relate to the new NFIP rules that are being considered under FEMA. If cities are going to want to keep their ability to have NFIP insurance for properties, it's going to be really important that that's something we consider in this process. And then second comment, I guess more of a request, Beth, would you be able to share what kind of the quantifiable methodology is for that redevelopment potential that you used for Medford, or for Madras? Sorry.
We did not use a quantifiable.
We did. Okay.
We did not, because we found it results in such poor information.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
If you have more budget to spend on it, and you can do more work on it, like Metro, spends more on it than a lot of these smaller cities can.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Beth, and thanks for the questions. Let's go to the next slide, and Karin.
All right. You guys are getting into the meat of it, which is great. So the department has heard that there are several opportunities we're aware of. We've heard from our local government partners and other entities. We have opportunities to provide greater certainty, greater clarity, to improve and refine some of the methodologies. And that can vary anywhere from what level of complexity should smaller resource constrained cities use when they're looking at their development capacity, all the way from CCNRs. How does that affect a community's development capacity? And there's a whole variety of issues in between. We've listed out a few, hoping that will spark some of your own experiences in your communities, what you're facing, what you would like to see addressed in our rulemaking. So Steve, I'd like to just prompt folks with these. We know that each of these topics could be an entire conversation on their own. And they will be. We will get to that in subsequent meetings. We will go deep. But for today, it would be great if we could get ideas, opinions, experiences out there. We're taking notes. We will collect all of this same way we did last time with the Miro board, where you guys provided all your comments up there. We're capturing all of this, and we'll have opportunity for you all to continue to add ideas. So if your idea doesn't come up in this moment today with us together, there's an opportunity to bring your idea, concern, issue, or comment post-meeting. There's also ample opportunity for us to continue discussing this in addition to estimating capacity as we move through some of our topic areas next month in April and in May as well. Steve, I'm going to let you guide us through the meat of our discussion. And Maddie, we can move to that next slide as folks are thinking about their own experiences in their communities, what challenges, what issues have come up, and what we can share with the group today.
Great, thank you, Karin, and yeah, let's open it up to that question to folks. We have about 10 minutes to just start to raise issues and start to raise ideas that we'll have further discussion about at future meetings. So try to do your best to be concise so we can have as many people speak as possible. Mary Kyle, start us off, please.
Okay, perhaps I should have done this in the last section. I thought it was just on that one slide, but I'll just raise 3 points I had. One is I noticed that publicly owned lands were not included in the buildable lands inventory, yet we've had past legislation and HPAC recommendations about including and being more rigorous about surplus public lands and making those available for housing and affordable housing. So I think there needs to be something addressed there. Secondly, I noticed in the materials that we received, and Beth said it, that the inventory was of residential lands that allow uses with clear and objective standards. I thought that was required for all residentially zoned lands, but maybe I'm mistaken on something. And then the last issue was on undevelopable land, and I noticed it in the Madras example. Vacant tax lots less than 3,000 square feet in size are considered undevelopable, but with our middle housing and other legislation we've passed, that seems an unreasonable exclusion because those are exactly the lots where we want infill and redevelopment. So those are my 3 points. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Let's go to Damien.
Thanks, Steve. I have a couple points. Glad to see partially vacant lands on the last slide. I think I have an odd question or twist on that category of land, and looking at partially vacant lands and whether that would apply to lands in residential zones that are not developed with residential uses. And I'm thinking for examples like churches, assisted living facilities, semi-residential, but trying to look at what might be available on properties where it's not developed for housing, but you may have an owner that might want to surplus some land. So somewhat similar to the last comment about, looking at public lands. And then also, I'd like to talk about later on, just getting some clarity on how to best account for mixed use zones where we're trying to allow mixed uses, we're trying to allow multiple story developments, and then really kind of accounting for how much of our buildable lands inventory should be accounted for when looking at those categories. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Damien. Brandon.
Yeah, for me, the one thing that kind of jumps to my head in using Umatilla as an example is just maybe a little bit of flexibility, especially for maybe smaller municipalities on when we start to consider land development or consider land developed. So from our latest UGB expansion effort, I'll use myself an example. So we were only able to justify about 200 acres of industrial land through our whole analysis process. Or 150 acres. We were able and successful to go get that. And now we've had one major developer come into town 3 years later, and I'm out of inventory. So from the small city perspective, where we're not able to justify, large chunks of property that we're able to go out and master plan, right? We're kind of having to grab smaller chunks. One development can essentially wipe out your whole inventory and, a larger development. So how do we maybe start to help some smaller jurisdictions be able to take maybe some smaller bites or, maybe look at development? I don't necessarily want to say phase, but just trying to realize that for smallest jurisdictions, obviously UGB, they're huge efforts, but how can we maybe make this a little bit more sustainable? So if you are a smaller city and you have one successful effort, you're not kind of having to re-up to the counter to swing at another UGB expansion.
Thank you, Brandon. Brock.
A couple comments. One, I think the timing aspect here is going to be huge. We have our BLIs. Typically, that's not the most time-intensive process of part of a urbanization UGB expansion, right? But we are, trying to make sure that we have our housing capacity analyses done every 6-8 years. And as we're doing UGB expansions, sometimes those can take 9+, for example. But just the city of North Plains, they had a legislative hearing about it. They were saying that it's taken them 9 years just to get to where they are, and it still hasn't gone all the way through the process. Much longer than what that HCA window would apply to. The other thing I think I want to bring up right now is just that when we're talking about BLI and as we start to get more into development readiness as it relates to infrastructure and things like that, not only just accounting for proximity of infrastructure, but also capacity of existing infrastructure. For example, if there's a predominantly single family home neighborhood in an area, right, and we want to redevelop that, and if we can get higher density out of it, that's great. But to what extent is the infrastructure that already is there able to support it? For example, it was built out to maybe support something around, 5 to 6 units per net acre, as opposed to 20. And so proximity to infrastructure is important, but also capacity of that infrastructure and how that's going to need to be upgraded and the cost to do so is going to be a really important consideration as well.
Great. Thank you, Brock. Ted.
So for the metro region, the part of this work that has, I think, the most ambiguity and requires a lot of our attention is the redevelopment and infill piece. We had some questions come up about this, and as Beth mentioned, you can throw a lot of resources at answering this question. My experience has been that this is pretty different than the inventory portion of the work, and this is really getting into forecasting about what the market might do over the next 20 years. So to get better answers to that, we've changed how we do that part of the work. Every time we come up in our 6-year cycle for doing this work. When I started, we used a simple refill rate, which was basically the share of new development that we forecasted was going to be through redevelopment and infill. It was based on historic observations. We then have moved to what we called a strike price that looked at property or land and improvement values and tried to figure out whether it was financially feasible to redevelop. This time around, we've hired a consultant team with Echo Northwest and Johnson Economics to develop a regional pro forma model that attempts to do even more sophisticated modeling of redevelopment potential region-wide. So these are estimates, though. They are forecasts. So I think that's sort of what makes this difficult to have specific rules about how to do it, because it depends on your market conditions and what assumptions you make.
Thank you, Ted. Corey.
Yeah, thanks. So I had 3 comments to share, similar to what Mary Kyle flagged for the undevelopable and public lands, given where, legislative and policy direction is going on those pieces, having some discussion there. I think another thing I would add to that bucket is commercial and adaptive reuse. So we've all seen with COVID, things that are sort of happening and changing, and how and where commercial spaces are being utilized. And so I think that also kind of merits a look in this conversation. Two other comments. The question here says, where is the greatest amount of ambiguity in sort of how current BLIs are set up? And I think for me, where my eye went was this likely to redevelop, right? And it kind of gets at what Ted just shared, and Beth and others of, there's so many different assumptions that you can make and factors to look at to sort of help answer that question. And so I feel like that for me stands out as something that has a great deal of ambiguity around it. And then I think my final thing that I just wanted to put in the room is sort of like, we're always striving for this sort of like balance between like prescriptiveness and flexibility. And so I think that, even hearing in the example from Madras and Metro, just how there's so much difference between how cities conduct these things. Really trying to figure out like, what are the places that really make sense to kind of put some more clear parameters around things, particularly for smaller jurisdictions. So those are ones I wanted to share with the group. Thanks.
Thank you, Corey. We're winding down our time here. Let's go to Kasara.
All right, trying to make this quick. I agree with others that, a lot of ambiguity around the redevelopment potential and infill. And then you bring in middle housing. What is that going to redevelop as? Is it a single unit or a triplex? I think one of the biggest assumptions for some of these urban reserve areas that are in the UGB, not yet in a city, is that the whole area is going to annex, especially within that 20-year time frame. We look at a lot of the past expansion areas, and there are a lot of parcels that still haven't come in yet. So, something that we should keep in mind.
Thank you, Kasara. Brock.
Again, more of a request than a question. Does DLCD have data that they could share with the group, indicating, I guess what percentage of lands, how many acres versus total residential acres have been redeveloped in the last 20 years from now? So 2004 to, or maybe 2001 to 2020, or 2003 to 2023, right? So we get a clear 20-year window, just so we can see kind of what redevelopment rate actually looks like broadly across the state.
Yeah, I'm going to do a quick answer to that, but Kevin, you jump in if I miss anything. I'm coming from local government to state, and that was one of the initial questions I had joining the LCD. Our agency has been rather small over the last few decades. Some of you are very familiar with our agency, our capacity, and our resources. Brock, that would take quite a bit of geographical analysis. It also takes quite a bit of data coming in from local government partners to us, and our ability to organize that data, analyze that data, and share it out. I'll be honest, we currently do not have that, but we also have a relatively new director, and that is a priority of our director, is to build that capacity and resources within the department. So we're aware of the need. We're also aware of our limitations, and we are very proactively working on building up that new resources so we can answer those questions. Not only to gather the data for our policy direction and decision making, but to share it out to our local partners. We're going to talk a lot about, I swear I drank some water before I did this. We're going to talk a lot about how we create rules that work for smaller cities with capacity constraints. And if the department can be a resource in that way, and that's a good point you bring up. So the short answer was no, but I felt like I needed to give some context around that answer.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Karen.
All right, last one, Mary Kyle, and then we're going to move to our recap and next steps.
I think a question we should ask in this context and throughout is, where do we want to see redevelopment and what's getting in the way of redeveloping? And not just, oh, it's not redeveloping, but these are areas that are already inside city limits, maybe also inside the urban growth bound, or they're inside the urban growth boundary, maybe also inside city limits. They already have some infrastructure and they're already closer into other stuff, and not just residential lands, but also commercial lands, parking lots, et cetera. So I think we need to add to this the question of how do we want to encourage redevelopment if it's not happening at the rate that we'd like and in the places we'd like.
Thank you, Mary Kyle, and thanks everyone for your contributions today. This is a great I'm not going to try to recap everything that people mentioned, but it's great to get some ideas out on the table as we plan our next meeting and subsequent meetings. Next meeting, make sure you have it in your calendar. I believe everyone should have received a calendar invite, April 18th, Thursday from 1:30 to 3 p.m. We'll look forward to seeing you again at that time. Karen, do you want to say a little bit about resource requests?
Yeah, absolutely. I get the privilege of letting you all know there's no homework after today's meeting. Some of the tags have a little bit of homework in between meeting. We're going to keep it pretty light for you all. We have none for you between now and April. But there might be a little bit between April and May. So just keep a heads up on that. And what I mean by that is you all received that project digest leading up to this meeting, I think a month ago, maybe in February, and Maddie mentioned it. We will keep you updated on the work we're doing, things that we're researching, where we're advancing some of our work internally here at the agency. But we're also going to reach out to you for these examples. There are very unique stories in different communities. And I think to Ariel's point, every community has a unique situation and we can't be everywhere all the time. But you all know within your county, hey, DLCD, you should know about this issue that came up during an HCA analysis process in this county. Here's a couple cities you should look at and look at their experience. Maybe going back 10 years, going back 5 years, maybe going back a couple years, what's happening and what should we look into in relationship to all of the things you all have brought up here. So look for emails from us, specifically that project digest. We will be requesting from you all examples, experiences, folks that we should talk to around these subjects, whether it be infrastructure and providing facilities, or whether it be exchanges or amendment processes to UGBs. So I wanted to let you all know that while we don't have any for you after this meeting, to be looking for that. The other piece is, Steve, if I have 1 minute, I think I have a couple minutes.
You do, yeah.
We would also like to extend this conversation. We know that ideas are going to come to you probably tonight while you're sitting at dinner or just before you go to bed tonight. You're like, oh, I wish I would have brought this up, and I just thought of it. So we're experimenting with a platform called Miro Board, which you all used at the orientation. We're going to open that up post-meeting. If there's anything you want to add, any comments you want to highlight, we'll capture those on the Miro Board in between meetings, and we can share out themes of what we gather from each meeting so you guys can see what each other are thinking. So I'm going to do my very best attempt. Within a few minutes of closing out our meeting, you should get an invite to this Miro board that we've created. I'm going to double check myself. And just in case these invites often go to spam or junk mail, or we've had instances where they just don't make it to their destination, I might attempt to just do an email in the way you guys have been receiving communications from me, and I'll link you straight to that Miro board. If for any reason you have not been invited to a Miro board or can't use the link by tomorrow or by Friday morning, is that tomorrow? Tomorrow's Friday. Just shoot me an email or call me up and we'll work on it with you. So I want to make sure you have access to that. And if for any reason that doesn't work for us, we'll figure out a way to get comments from each of you if you have something you want to share in between meetings.
And Karen, how long do we expect to have that Miro board open? Because I know we want to get comments into our meeting summaries as well.
And that's why I have you, Steve, because I always forget something at the end. So I'll keep the Miro board and collecting comments through Friday and Monday, and then we'll close that out Tuesday morning so that we can summarize this meeting.
Great. Again, thanks to everyone. We look forward next time to digging in deeper into buildable land inventories and estimating capacity and the assumptions and methodologies that go along with that. Really great start today, great conversation. Appreciate everyone participating. Have a great rest of your week and spring break if you're so inclined, and we look forward to seeing you in April.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, everybody.
Thank you.